Well, why don't we get started today and bring it together? So I talked about this, about what you can tell about a person by the way they wear their mask, um, is what I chose for the title when this came up, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the pandemic, of course, has been wearing on. We've been getting um, long into it. I think we're getting really tired of it in lots of ways. The restraints and the restrictions are difficult. And we've got to see a lot about how different people have responded to being restrained this way. It's been a sort of test of character, right? We can't just find one simple solution to it. You can't just not go to the store ever or not go out ever. You have to make these decisions about what's worth it and whether you need to do it, right? What's important enough and what isn't. So in that way, it's been a test of values for each person, deciding what's important enough for themselves, deciding where to take risks. It's been a test of character. So then I came across this study that had recently been done in Israel. And so Israel had a mask mandate, and there was a substantial fine if people in public weren't wearing masks. And so some psychologists got the idea to run a study to see what you could tell about people from the way that they wear their masks. In particular, they did a classic test to study people's honesty. So it's called, what you do is you roll a die, it goes 1 to 6. The higher number you get, the more money they give you. But you do it underneath the cup. So you're the only person who sees it. They don't get to see it. And you have to report out what you see. Now, of course, they don't know from this test whether any one person is lying, but they can average the groups. And the average, they said, should come back about 3.5. So if it comes back higher than 3.5, then you know that people in that group were lying, typically lying. That happens frequently. In fact, the average just for people ends up being about 4 or a little bit higher than that. So the average is how they can tell what kind of groups are honest. So when they did this with the masks, right, there were 3 different groups that they're looking at. One were the people who were wearing their mask properly. The other one was people who weren't wearing a mask at all, right, who didn't follow the rules. And the third one were the people who were wearing it improperly, either with their nose sticking out or maybe down around their chin or something like that. Interestingly, right, what we come back with is the people who are wearing their mask properly were about average in terms of their honesty. They came back a little bit around 4, that same sort of area. The next best group were the people who are not wearing a mask at all. They were a little less honest. They were about 4.3. So they were a little bit less honest, but not a lot less honest. But the people who were wearing their mask improperly were significantly less honest than the rest. So their honesty was lower when they didn't wear their mask properly. Now, of course, you don't get to ask them why, and you don't get to investigate what's going on there or what this is, but it makes a certain amount of sense, right? The people who are wearing their mask properly have demonstrated a willingness to cooperate, right? There's a moral requirement, something that we all need to do in order to reap a benefit. Masks are kind of interesting because they don't provide that much benefit to the person wearing them, at least the sort of the ordinary cloth mask that we wear. They provide the benefit to other people. And so it's a question of whether you're willing to do your part. So they, right, the people who wear their mask properly, not too surprising that they turned out to be relatively honest, willing to do their part there as well. The people who didn't wear a mask, who were violating this openly, also showed a certain amount of honesty in the way that they were willing to say that they don't believe in this and they're going to take the risk and they're going to take the punishment, right, for what it is. So even though they're wrong in the way they're approaching this, they're not doing their part, they're honest about that in the way they're not doing their part. So they were a bit better. They still were more likely to be cheating on this than others. It's those people who wore their mask improperly, right? Well, what does this show? What does this show? It doesn't show, right, the same kind of open choice to disobey a requirement. They wanted to be ready, right? They have the mask. They're trying not to get fined, but they don't actually want to do it right. They don't have it covered, right? They're not set to be prepared. If anybody critiques them, calls them out, wants to try to give them a ticket, right, they can just pull their mask up. They can say sorry, right? They can move on. It gives them an excuse. So what this test is suggesting is that it's not that they don't know how to wear their mask properly. Since it correlates with their honesty, it starts to seem like they're the kind of people who shirk, who don't follow through with their full requirements. that we've got a pattern, right, of these people putting a low value on social cooperation. Of course, I mean, one of the reasons that this catches my attention is that it is tempting, of course, to judge these people, to look and say, those people don't know what they're doing. I, of course, am wearing my mask correctly. I can be proud of that. I can be vain about that. I can think that I am good, and they are bad, or at least it's very tempting to start thinking like that. But it's important to remember that there are a lot of these psychological experiments that suggest that people don't have as much of a character as they might think they do. Now, a character would be a settled pattern of thought and feeling. That is a tendency to think about things in a certain way, a tendency to feel in certain ways. So if someone has a character trait of being honest, they tend to tell the truth. They tend to feel that that's important. They tend to think like that. When we say think like that, it means that they don't think about how they can cheat. It doesn't occur to them lies that they could get away with. They don't approach the world in that way at all. That they have that tendency. So when people don't have characters, what it suggests is that they are more influenced by their circumstances and their situation. You probably know the classic experiments, right? The Stanford prison experiment, where they took a random group of people and made them prisoners, and a random group of people and made them into the guards, and through the experiment, the guard people bullying and so on and so forth, because they're in that situation. So the claim is, it isn't that that people who become prison guards are already having a certain kind of character. It's that situation generates that in just about anyone. At least that's the claim of the experiment. The Milgram experiment's another famous one, where people were asked to shock people when they got the wrong answers. It wasn't actually hooked up, but they believed that it was. And a lot of people obeyed authority and went a long way in that direction. Both of those studies have their critics as to how much they show, but they both raise that question sharply to say that people don't really respond that well from their character. They tend to respond from the circumstance. Another classic study in this area, one that was a little more carefully constructed, is the one where you have two people in a room. One of them is a co-conspirator with the experimenters, and a third person walks through, goes in the other room, and then you hear them scream and crash, and so then they dropped what they were carrying or something of the kind. If the second person gets up to go see what's going on, the person they're experimenting on does that as well 70% of the time. So almost always will go along to help. If the second person does not get up, then the first person, the person they're experimenting on, will get up to go along about 7% of the time. So there's a huge difference, right, into whether or not we help other people based on whether the people around us do or don't. We look to them a lot for this way. We are easily influenced by social cues. So we don't necessarily know from the previous experiments whether people who wear the mask are honest. We got to keep in mind, right, they were being threatened, and they may have other sorts of reasons, right, for behaving the way that they did. The dye test kind of suggests that because they weren't being observed, right, they weren't seeing it that way, but it doesn't guarantee that that's what's going on. They certainly might be dishonest in other areas of their life, other situations, other components. They might not be as good as they feel like they are. But that raises, to my mind, a challenge for us. The question becomes, how can we develop a character? As long as we continue to be easily influenced by the things around us, as long as we continue to be influenced by the people around us, we're likely to, whether or not we do something good or bad is a matter of luck more than our own choices. Like, we're lucky to happen to be around people that do things well, or we're lucky to happen to not be experiencing political pressures to not wear a mask or something along those lines. We don't want it to be a matter of luck. So to do that, we need to try to develop a character. We need to try to become the kind of people who can resist when the social circumstances and the situation push us in the wrong direction. In many cases, what we depend on our social circumstances for is a kind of moral perception. So when I think about the case of the person who gets up and goes in the other room to help, it's a question of whether you perceive that help is needed. If someone else perceives that need and demonstrates that they perceive that need, it's easy for you to notice, to care, to make sense of that, and therefore to go along. In other cases, though, it's not obvious. Just because somebody is having a problem doesn't necessarily mean they want your help or that they need your help. Um, we don't always notice other people's problems or other people's issues because we're not paying attention. So, in one way, developing a character is a question of learning to perceive situations in certain ways, see where our help is needed, see how it can be done, recognize where it isn't, where it can't be, and try to do that not necessarily regardless of the others around us, but not depending on them to make that perception and define it for us. So, what can we do to help develop a character? What in particular might help? Well, these same scientists have looked at some of these things and developed various answers. The first one is reliable, but kind of interesting in what it does. They say we need to select our situations. That is, be careful who you are around or what you're around or where you are. Um, I think that one's interesting because it doesn't directly change your character or your choices. It changes sort of the temptation and what others do. If you want to be a helpful person, be around helpful people. You'll just fit in, right? You'll go right along. In a way, it doesn't change that character. But what it does do is start develop a habit of thinking like that. So the way that other people around you think bleed into you. I think this is something we're not necessarily careful enough about. And we're not always able to control. Like you can't always control who you're around or who you're dealing with. But we can think something about the situations where we're likely to make mistakes or the situations where we're likely to be blind and try to avoid those situations, or if we're going into them, try to counteract our tendencies. Which points to the second one. We need to be paying attention to ourselves and what we do well and what we don't. This is useful. This is something one can often do, say, at the end of the day or at the end of the week, right? Is say, okay, what sorts of things have I done well and what haven't? What sorts of situations did I respond well and I haven't? Knowing yourself and your tendencies are going to be the next step to understanding your particular vulnerabilities. Do you tend to be indifferent to others and oblivious? Do you tend to get angry too quickly? Do you tend to let people take advantage of you? Maybe the other side of it, right? Let people take advantage of you too much and not stand up for yourself enough. If you start to recognize these tendencies, then you can start to look for the cues that you're sort of doing that kind of thing, that it might happen, that it's that the situation is moving in that direction. So being attentive to your life, to how you're living your life, is the next one that they recommend. The last one would be finding moral exemplars. That is, the way to think about becoming better is looking at particular people and taking them as examples. Now, what's interesting here is people often misunderstand this. When they want to say moral exemplars, they often think what they're looking for are saints or some sort of perfect people that you're going to imitate. And that doesn't actually help a lot. That is, if they're totally different from you, if they're miles ahead of you, then they don't help you think about your situations and the ones you're in. What you need is moral exemplars of people who are a little bit better than you, who are doing better in a capacity where you need some help. And to think about them and how they see the situation and how they would understand it. What this means is that you're better at taking control of a situation, if at least one where you're having a problem, I should say. You're better at taking control of a situation where you have a problem if you're able to step outside of yourself and say, how would someone else look at this situation? How would someone who you respect, who you know, who struggled with this, look at this situation? This ties into Jason's talk last week. I think this is another value that literature might provide. You do get to see the world through other people's eyes, the experiments, the thoughts and feelings that other people have. And if you're selective about what you choose from that, and that's an important qualification, but if you're selective about what you choose from that, you can help build your character in the right direction, start to think of yourself and how you can get better by paying attention to the way those people think and feel and interact in those kinds of situations. The last piece of advice that I think is important, though they haven't studied, is staying clear about the good that you can do and the good that you can't do. I think we often spend a lot of our energy worrying about things that we cannot change, things that aren't within our power. Now, those things may still be good and they might be useful, but the more of your time and energy that's spent on them, the less you're paying attention to the good that you can do. So we let a lot of good slip by because we're angry about the state of the world, or we're absorbed in thinking about ideas that aren't relevant to here and now. And we don't see the opportunities that we have to do good right in front of us. Um, I can think it can be tempting to, focus your attention on things that you can't control, because that doesn't place any demand on you. It doesn't require you to respond. It doesn't pull you in that direction. It can be a sort of relaxation maybe to do that, but a lot of people, it gets much worse than that. It's a temptation to spend your energy frustrated, right, that others won't do the thing they need to do, which is what brings me back to the masks. I mean, I certainly, when I go out, see people that are wearing their mask incorrectly, and it's one of the things that has struck me as really frustrating. It's like, why do they do that? What is it about that? But of course, every minute I spend thinking about them um, is a waste of my time, because I can't do anything about that. There are certain things I could do, right? Certain things that are within my power. And if I think about those and decide to do them or not, that was what would be best. So if I decide that I am going to confront somebody and talk to them, then that's what I need to do. And I need to have a plan to do that. And that is within my power. Whether or not they respond is not. Just try to get very close. That's another thing that is within my power. I'm going to shop at different hours when fewer people are there. That is within my power. But to make them behave is simply not something that I can do with where I'm at. So I don't want to spend too much time worrying about how other people are wearing their masks. That can quickly be a distraction.